Hi there everyone. This is the second part of the 3.01 video or lesson, the bubble bursts. And we were on page 676, starting with the Great Depression. That's where we left off. Several main causes brought about the Great Depression. The stock market bubble lifted investors, including individuals, banks, and corporations, to new heights of speculation. People bought more stock than they could afford, often by borrowing, and drove up stock prices to far more than they were worth. American manufacturers produced more goods than Americans could afford to buy. Even in these seemingly prosperous times, many Americans, especially farm families, were very poor, and most of the wealth remained in the hands of a few. Many of the nation's banks engaged in risky lending practices that put people's savings in danger. International debts and tariffs paralyzed trade between nations. In October 1929, in the days just following the stock market crash, many people thought the crisis might pass quickly. After all, businessmen argued the economy was bound to go through cycles of boom and bust, of good times and hard times. So the best approach was to wait and let the problems work themselves out. Vice President Charles Curtis announced, "Prosperity is just around the corner." Hoover's initial response to the crisis. Here, let's look at this picture before we read. The crash on Wall Street did not pass quickly as many as hoped it would. And the sign here on this man's car says $100 will buy this car, must have cash, lost all on the stock market. Hoover's initial response to the crisis. To many people, Herbert Hoover seemed, until the stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression, the ideal president. Hoover was an engineer who had been a very successful businessman and had served as Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge. Hoover never ran for any office before the Republican Party nominated him for president in 1928. As soon as he was inaugurated on March 1929, he went right to work on what he saw as the uncompleted tasks in government. These tasks included legislation to help farmers, outreach to African Americans, lowering the income tax, and scaling back the red hunts aimed at suspected communists. One journalist wrote admiringly about the new president. The modern technical mind was for the first time at the head of a government, almost with the air of giving a genius his chance. We waited for the performance to begin. When the Depression got underway, Hoover did all he felt he could to deal with the challenge, but he was cautious in his approach. Hoover believed, as his predecessors had, that business and the economy could run themselves with almost no outside interference. The previous occupant of the White House, Calvin Coolidge, had asserted that the business of America is business, and the government's job was to mainly not interfere with the workings of business. Such an attitude, which had remained constant through the 1920s, was so deeply entrenched that when the crash came, Hoover and other leaders were reluctant to change their economic policies, even after the economy had changed dramatically. The economic crisis, said Hoover, cannot be cured by legislative action or by executive pronouncement. He believed that the government should not be involved in the daily lives of citizens. Although Hoover was known as a great humanitarian, during World War I he had volunteered to run relief efforts to feed starving Europeans. He persisted in seeing more harm than good, in allowing government to take over the task of feeding and sheltering the poor. "I do not believe that the power and duty of the government ought to be extended to the relief of an individual's suffering," he said. As more and more Americans sank into poverty, Hoover called on churches, state and local governments, charitable organizations, and private citizens to meet the challenge of helping those who could not help themselves. Direct federal aid, he thought, would lead to a cumbersome bureaucracy and dangerously increase the federal government's budget. Moreover, Hoover believed in what he called rugged individualism, a spirit of individual initiative and enterprise through which our people have grown to unparalleled greatness. Government assistance, he argued, would so diminish people's already battered self-respect that they might never be able to stand on their own again. Even as Hoover looked to volunteerism and a spirit of rugged individualism to rescue the nation from its crisis, he also worked to implement what he saw as appropriate government responses. In November 1929, just a month after the crash, Hoover called the leaders of the nation's biggest businesses to the White House to discuss how to keep the financial panic from spreading. He then announced steps to make more credit available so that businesses could borrow money to keep operating. He persuaded railroad and utility executives and local governments to undertake construction programs to keep more people employed. At first, these modest measures appeared to do some good. Hoover said in May 1930, "I am convinced we have passed the worst. With continued effort we shall rapidly recover." But the worst was yet to come. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff. In 1930, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. Hoover was confident that his high tax on imported goods would strengthen the American economy by protecting American jobs and businesses against foreign competition. But more than 1,000 economists signed a petition against the legislation. Many investors also thought the high tariffs would hurt business. They were right. Other countries promptly passed their own high tariffs in retaliation, and international trade virtually ground to a halt. With businesses around the world losing sales, workers were laid off. With workers unemployed and thus unable to purchase goods, businesses lost even more sales and so laid off still more employees. With less money flowing between nations, banks across Europe began to fail, and the Great Depression became a global crisis. In June 1930, just after President Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Bill into law, the stock market crashed again. In the last 2 months of 1930, 600 banks collapsed. The growing crisis in Europe. By early 1931, the wave of bank failures and the onset of the economic crisis in Europe made it clear that the Depression was deepening. In June 1931, Hoover tried to address the growing crisis in Europe by proposing a year-long pause in the payment of World War I debts owed by European nations to the United States. Congress eventually authorized the move, but it did little to help. By September 1931, worried depositors in England were withdrawing gold from British banks, leaving those institutions without capital. In response, England abandoned the gold standard, which meant that its paper money could no longer be exchanged for gold. The United States refused to go along, fearing its money would become worthless if it were to no longer be backed by hard metal. Then many people started to withdraw all the gold they could from American banks. This wave of withdrawals led to more bank failures. The government tried next to raise the interest it changed. The government next tried to raise the interest it charged on the money it lent. This measure was supposed to discourage borrowing and thus retain more money in the Treasury and banks. But business needed to be able to borrow to keep operating. Without credit to help them meet their expenses, many companies failed. And that is where we'll end reading for today. The next section will start in tomorrow's lesson, the 3.02. So let's go back. Whoop, wrong lesson. Let's go back here to lesson 301, the bubble burst. We just completed the reading. Make sure that you've got your reading guide filled out. Check your answers with a lesson answer key. And then let's continue to the dollar drops activity. The stock market crash and subsequent depression brought troubling realities as unemployment grew and poverty spread across America. When you have finished today's reading assignment, complete the dollar drops online activity. Review some important economic terms to help you understand the events that unfolded in the American economy. Match each term with the correct definition to see what happened to the value of the American dollar during the tumultuous times of the Depression. During the 1920s, business boomed and Americans seemed to enjoy a time of prosperity. But appearances were deceptive. In the late 1929, the bottom dropped out of the stock market. The stock market crash and subsequent Great Depression brought troubling realities as unemployment grew and poverty spread across America. Review some important economic terms to help you understand the events that unfolded in the American economy. All right, so let's start. Let's turn over a key term. An extended period of economic decline more severe than a recession. So that would be a depression. And that's not bonds. So is this a match? No. So let's find the word depression. There we go. That's not a match, but I would know where depression is now. So we can match these two up. Is that a match? Yes, it's correct. Okay, let's look for a period of economic decline based on gross domestic product lasting at least 6 months. Okay, that would be a recession. So now we have to find, that's not securities, that's not a match. That's not bubble, stocks. No, I'm looking for securities. Not speculation. No, not a match. There we go, recession. Yes, that's a match. Okay, next. Bank run. Okay, where would we find bank run? Depositors rushing to draw more funds than the bank has available to pay. Oh my goodness, I found it on the first one. Correct. Okay, this one, bonds. Okay, where can we find the definition for bonds? Oh, wrong thing. Not a match. Money that a company borrows and agrees to pay with interest. Nope. shares of ownership a company sold to raise money. Okay, I know that's stocks. Oh, and that's not right either. Let's find the word stocks. There we go. That's a match. Okay, let's securities. What's the definitions for securities? Buying with assumption, but not the assurance that investment profits will be made. Well, I know that's speculation. So let's find the word speculation. There's speculation. So now I can match up the two. It's kind of difficult because this is like memory, the game memory, and also trying to know the definitions. Okay, a temporary increase in stock prices caused by speculation but not based on real worth. Okay, that's bubble. So where's the word bubble? There it is. Most wonderful. Financial instruments including stocks and bonds used by firms or governments to raise money. That's securities. And then the last two we have bonds, money that a company borrows and agrees to pay with interest. And that is correct. And we get an image of a dollar, and what's happening? The dollar is burning up, it's disintegrating. And that's kind of a sad representation of the Great Depression. Okay, finish up by completing the 3.01 checkpoint for today. And that will conclude today's 3.01 lesson. Good luck on your checkpoint.